So let's go to the next stage, planning the interview. And this is where, as I said, proper planning allows you to get most from the interview and to minimize the time spent. Effective planning involves gathering in advance as many facts as possible about the offence and the interviewee, establishing a location and time for the interview that will be conducive to success. So what do we mean, Neil? Well, yes, we've got that idea of who our interviewee is. We know where they are, or we have a sense of where they are in terms of denial, anger, rationalization, depression, acceptance. All right. But now you've got to be aware of what are you doing on your planning side in terms of the focus of your interview. What is the goal of your interview? Is your goal to get a confession? Is your goal to seek information? Is your goal to get further sources of evidence so you can build a stronger case? You need to be very clear about the goal of the interview. Now, the textbook does talk about a lot of detail in the planning in terms of these 4 areas. That is, effective planning, as I just mentioned, you gather the facts. You need to have the right location and time. Great. All right. So we're going to spend a little bit more time in terms of how we gather those facts in coming parts. But you need to be aware of your own demeanor. How sensitive are you to the whole process? How sincere are you? And how humane are you? And professional and unbiased are you in this interview process? That takes a lot of experience. It takes time to establish the demeanor of an unbiased interviewer. And there's a lot of aspects here you may need to think about. Your appreciation of the interviewee in providing and helping with the inquiry, because you're not getting that interviewee across the confession line. Or maybe it's being non-authoritarian even when you know the interviewee has committed the offence and you've got to get them across the confession line. And provide sympathy and respect, trying to understand their rationalisation for what they did. All right. And then there's a whole area of question typology you need to consider in your planning about how you are going to get them to admit the theft act. How are you going to assess them if you believe that they are giving you dishonest answers? How are you going to introduce yourself and the whole premise of the interview? How are you going to close the interview? And of course, there are different do's and don'ts of interviews, like avoiding leading questions, the topic focus, short focused questions, and trying to get narrative answers rather than yes or no answers. Wow, there's a lot to consider in just planning an interview. And many of these items will become second nature after years and years of practice. And you can do this if it interests you. Wow, planning an interview. Finally, in this part, the elements and facilitators of communication. Just be aware that people are motivated to communicate for different reasons. They want to express themselves, or they want to persuade other people, or they're seeking therapy, or it's ritual, it's information exchange. Keep that in mind as potential motives for why an interviewee may share stories with you. And so there's a bit of theory on communication here where it talks about elements of communications as well. As you can see, you could spend a whole semester studying communication alone. All right. And I think one of the most interesting parts that I find as an element of communication that relates to an investigation interview is catharsis. And that is getting release from unpleasant tensions by talking. And so this is the idea that depending on where the interviewee is, catharsis may work in your favor if you can get them to feel release from the mental gymnastics they are going through because they are trying to rationalize the bad theft act that they have undertaken. And that release can come by allowing them to confess, allowing them to explain why they did what they did. And then that helps them feel better because it helps release unpleasant tensions by them talking. So if you can get the interviewee into that state, which is pretty hard sometimes, then catharsis can really work to your favor to get that person across the confession line. So I'm not going to go through all of those elements of communication, but I thought catharsis is probably the most powerful of all of these features of communication. Wow. All right, we're near the end of part 1. What we're going to do in part 2 is look at the mechanics of the interview. There's a lot to come in the coming parts. So let me just stop and I'll see you in the next part. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.